There's a dot. That is how it started. Not a headline, not a dramatic collapse on stage, not a publicist's carefully worded statement. Just a dot, a small, silent, barely visible shadow on a lung scan, discovered almost by accident while a doctor was looking for something else entirely. Hip pain brought him in. Bronchitis had already come and gone. But the doctor ordered one more image, and there it was. A that had no symptoms. A dot that caused no pain. A dot that, if the timing had been even slightly different, might never have been caught at all. And now here is the question that hangs in the air like a held note at the end of a ballad. How does a man who has spent over 60 years making the world feel something, who has sold more than 85 million records, who has filled arenas across 5 continents, who has written some of the most achingly beautiful pop songs ever committed to tape? How does that man sit in a hospital room at 82 years old and reckon with how close he came to disappearing without warning? And here is the deeper question, the one that reaches beneath the fame and the sequin jackets and the soaring choruses. Who is Barry Manilow, really? Not the performer, not the legend. The man behind the music who kept so much of himself hidden for so long that even his most devoted fans, the ones who called themselves Fanilows and memorized every lyric, who filled Madison Square Garden and wept at the sound of his voice, even they did not know the whole truth. What does it mean to live publicly and privately at the same time for decades, and then face mortality with all of it still unresolved? That is what this story is actually about. Barry Allen Pincus was born on June 17, 1943, in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, and the circumstances of his birth already contained the seeds of everything that would define him. His father, Harold Kelleher, was an Irish-American truck driver, a man of working-class roots who carried within him a complicated ethnic inheritance, Jewish on one side, Catholic-Irish on the other. His mother, Edna Manilow, came from a Russian Jewish immigrant family, and her parents did not approve of Harold, not even a little. The Irish truck driver was considered, in the bluntest terms, an embarrassment, an unsuitable match, a secret to be managed rather than a man to be celebrated. And so Edna's family demanded the extraordinary. Harold had to change his name. They dug back through his family tree to the 1800s, found a single Jewish ancestor, a man named Pincus, and insisted Harold take that name instead. Barry entered the world not as Barry Kelleher, not as Barry Manilow, but as Barry Pincus, a name built on concealment, a name that announced, before he could even speak, that identity in this family was something to be shaped, adjusted, hidden, and managed according to what other people could accept. His father left when Barry was 2 years old. 2 years old. Not old enough to form a memory, not old enough to ask why, not old enough to feel the door close and understand what the silence meant, but old enough, eventually, to carry the weight of that absence. Edna's family made certain there would be no contact, no letters, no birthday cards, no explanation. Harold Kelleher simply ceased to exist in Barry's life as completely as if he had never been there at all. Years later, when Barry's grandfather changed the family name to Manilow just weeks before Barry's bar mitzvah, the erasure was complete. The Irish truck driver had been quietly written out of the family story. Barry was left with a name that was not quite his own, a father he would never know, and a childhood in a Williamsburg apartment where he found his first real comfort not in the arms of parents, but in music. His grandparents had a piano. That piano was the one thing in Barry's world that did not move, did not disappear, did not require explanation. He sat at it as a small child and found that his hands knew what to do. He taught himself by feel and by ear, chasing melodies that lived somewhere inside his chest before he had the technique to bring them out properly. Later, his stepfather, Willie Murphy, who came into Edna's life when Barry was still young, introduced him to jazz and to the grandeur of Broadway show tunes. Something lit up in Barry at the sound of those arrangements, the way a full orchestra could make a human emotion enormous. The way music could say things that words alone could never quite reach. He started carrying a little notebook everywhere. He wrote things down, fragments of melody, chord progressions, the beginnings of songs that had not yet found their reason to exist. That notebook, small, ordinary, filled with the private language of a lonely boy turning feeling into music, was the first version of who Barry Manilow would eventually become. He attended Eastern District High School in Brooklyn and graduated in 1961, then enrolled briefly at City College of the City University of New York before following his real passion to the New York College of Music and eventually to Juilliard. These were not the years of glamour. These were the years of cold subway rides and cheap apartments and working in the CBS mailroom to pay for everything. He sorted mail. He filed things. He sat in the fluorescent hum of an office building and dreamed of something larger. But the mailroom led, as mundane things sometimes do in the lives of people with talent, to something unexpected. He was eventually noticed by a director at CBS's local television affiliate, a man named Bro Herod, who saw that this quiet Brooklyn kid could do more than sort envelopes. In 1964, Herod asked Barry to arrange some songs for a musical adaptation of a play called The Drunkard. Barry was 21 years old. He did not just arrange the songs. He wrote an entire score. The wound that would define him, though, arrived not from failure, but from a marriage. In 1964, the same year he wrote that first score, Barry married Susan Deichsler, his high school sweetheart. She was, by his own admission, the perfect wife, kind, steady, devoted, everything a young man was supposed to want. He loved her. That part was real. But there was something else inside him, something he could not name cleanly at 21, something that pulled in a direction he did not yet have language for. His passion for music was insatiable, consuming, the kind of devotion that left little room for a shared domestic life in a Brooklyn apartment. And beneath the music, there was something deeper, something he would not be able to acknowledge for many more years. The growing understanding that the life he was supposed to want, the wife, the home, the conventional path, was not the life that matched who he actually was. He left Susan after 1 year. He called it immaturity. He called it his obsession with a musical career. He left her to pursue what he described as a wondrous musical adventure. But the truth was more complicated, and he knew it, and he carried that complication inside him like a stone he could not put down. The question of who Barry Manilow really was, not the performer, but the man, became the defining private drama of his life. In an era when being gay in America was not just socially stigmatized, but professionally ruinous, Barry made a calculation that millions of people in similar circumstances made in that same era. He kept quiet. He built walls. He performed a version of himself that was true in every musical dimension and sealed off in every personal one. He watched the 1970s unfold and understood instinctively that his audience, largely female, largely romantic in their attachment to him, in love with the idea of him as the sensitive man who understood heartbreak, would not, could not, in that cultural moment, receive the truth. So he held it tightly for decades, and the holding of it, the daily management of it, the loneliness of carrying that particular secret through sold-out arenas and Grammy stages and television specials, was a kind of private darkness that no spotlight could reach. By the early 1970s, Barry had found his way into a job that would change everything, though not in the direction anyone might have predicted. He was hired as a pianist and accompanist at a place called the Continental Baths in Manhattan, a gay bathhouse that had become an unlikely venue for live entertainment. It was here, in 1971, that he met a young, brash, electrifyingly talented singer named Bette Midler. She was performing for an audience that was almost entirely gay men, wrapped in towels, cheering from lounge chairs, hungry for something real and joyful and unashamed. Barry sat at the piano and played. Bette sang, and something extraordinary happened between them. Not romantic, but musical, the kind of connection that happens between two people who both feel things so intensely they have no choice but to express them. He became her music director. He produced her first two albums, The Divine Miss M and Bette Midler. Those records were revelations. The industry took notice. And when Betty's career caught fire, some of that flame landed on Barry. But before the fire arrived, there was a darkness so complete it threatened to swallow him. In the mid-1970s, before Mandy changed his life, Barry was burning through money, sleeping irregularly, working himself into a state of exhaustion that crossed the line into collapse. He was arranging for other artists, writing jingles. He wrote the jingles for Band-Aid, for State Farm, for McDonald's, those earworms that would outlast almost everything else from that era, and performing wherever he could, to whoever would listen. His confidence in his own voice was minimal. He did not believe he was a singer. He believed he was a musician who happened to have to sing because he could not afford to hire someone else. The sessions were brutal. The rejection from record labels was consistent and demoralizing. Barry Pincus from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, the kid without a father, the kid with the borrowed name, sitting in meeting rooms with label executives who saw potential but not stardom, who heard something but could not name it. Then came the moment that almost did not happen. A song called Brandy, written by Scott English and Richard Kerr, found its way to Barry. He recorded it, changed the name to Mandy because another song called Brandy already existed, and released it in late 1974. And then something happened that no one fully planned for. America fell in love with it. The song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1975. It was warm and aching and specific in its emotional texture, and it touched something in people that they had not known needed touching. Barry Manilow was suddenly, undeniably famous. But notice what that moment costs a person who is carrying a secret. The bigger the fame, the smaller the space for truth. As the arenas filled, as the album sales climbed into the tens of millions, as the teenage girls and the middle-aged women and the people who had never considered themselves pop music fans found themselves weeping to Can't Smile Without You, and Weekend in New England, and Looks Like We Made It, Barry understood with crystalline clarity that his private self had to stay exactly where it was. Invisible. Protected. The man who sang about longing more beautifully than almost anyone of his generation was living a kind of longing that he could not sing about at all. In 1978, he met Gary Keefe. Gary was a television executive, Houston-born, sharp and steady in the way that Barry was not, unrattled by the machinery of fame, capable of managing the enormous and chaotic enterprise that Barry's career had become. They met, and something in Barry recognized something in Gary the way a note finds its chord. "I knew that this was it," Barry would say, decades later, his voice carrying the weight of all those years of certainty lived in silence. "I was one of the lucky ones. I was pretty lonely before that." Gary became his manager, and his partner, and the great love of his life. A love kept so private that even people close to Barry did not always know its full dimension. Gary went to a concert early in their relationship and watched as fans surrounded the car Barry was riding in, rocking it, screaming, hysterical in their devotion. He looked at the spectacle and said, very quietly, "I don't think I can do this." Barry looked at him and said, simply, "I'm glad he stayed." Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the hits continued to come. Barry notched 13 #1 singles on the adult contemporary chart. He won a Grammy. He earned Emmys and a Tony Award. Frank Sinatra, in what amounted to a blessing from the highest cathedral of American popular music, looked at Barry Manilow in the mid-1970s and said simply, "He's next." Las Vegas eventually became his home, not his birth home, not Brooklyn with its memory of borrowed names and absent fathers, but his performing home, the city that understood spectacle and never asked too many personal questions. He set a residency record at the Westgate Las Vegas Resort, surpassing Elvis Presley's own Las Vegas record, a fact that would have seemed impossible to the kid sorting mail in the CBS mailroom. He sang to crowds that came back year after year, not just for nostalgia, but because something about the experience felt like church, like a place where emotion was permitted, where longing was given a melody, where you were allowed to feel things you could not otherwise articulate. But the scandal, if you want to call it that, arrived the way the lung cancer later would, quietly, from an unexpected direction, through someone else's words. In 2015, Suzanne Somers, who was a friend of Barry's, mentioned publicly that she had attended a private wedding ceremony. Barry and Gary had married in April 2014 at their 53-acre estate in Palm Springs, California, after same-sex marriage became legal in the state. They had exchanged rings. They had made their commitment legal and permanent and beautiful in the privacy of their home, surrounded by people who loved them. And then Suzanne Somers said something publicly, and the marriage became news. And the marriage meant that Barry's orientation became news. And suddenly, after more than 37 years together, after decades of the most carefully maintained privacy in the music industry, Barry Manilow was out. He was 71 years old. He had been with Gary for nearly 4 decades. He had sold 85 million records. He had written some of the most beloved pop songs of the 20th century. And he had never once, in all of that time, told the world the truth about who he loved. The response from his fans was not what he had feared. That is perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story. Not the secret, not the decades of concealment, but the discovery, when the secret finally came out, that he had been protecting himself from something that would not have harmed him nearly as badly as the protection itself had cost. When they found out that Gary and I were together, Barry said, his voice catching slightly on the words, they were so happy. They were happy. The Manilows, the women who had carried his voice with them through their own heartbreaks and losses and late nights and impossible longings. They were happy for him. I thought I would be disappointing them if they knew I was gay, he had said. So I never did anything. All those years. All that loneliness. For a fear that turned out to be unfounded. In 2017, Barry gave an interview to People magazine and spoke about it properly for the first time. He said it had been a non-event for me, really, because he and Gary had been together so long. But you can hear, beneath the casual phrasing, the weight of what it actually was. In the 1970s, coming out as a gay performer would have ended careers. He had watched it happen to others. He had understood the calculus with brutal precision. The public was not ready for anybody to come out, he said. And frankly, it was just too personal. The privacy was real. The fear was real. The loneliness was real. And the love, quiet, steady, enduring, tucked away in a Palm Springs estate far from the lights of any arena. That was the most real thing of all. Then came November 2025. Barry went to the doctor because his hip hurt. The kind of thing that happens when you are 82 and your body has spent 60 years performing, traveling, bending itself to the demands of a life in music. The doctor ordered an MRI for the pelvis, then remembered that Barry had recently recovered from bronchitis and ordered one more scan for the lungs. And there it was. The dot. Silent. Painless. Early-stage lung cancer on his left lung. If he hadn't done that, man, Barry said later, his voice barely holding, he saved my life because there's no symptoms for what I had. I could go on, nothing hurt, but they found the dot in my lung. He had been smoking since the age of 9, a habit that had lasted 30 years before he finally stopped at 39. And then vaping had taken smoking's place, a different delivery system for the same chemical need, photographed in his hands in the days before the surgery itself. 60-plus years of a relationship with nicotine, and the bill had finally arrived. He underwent surgery to remove a lobe of his left lung in January 2026. Then he spent 7 days in the intensive care unit. 7 days. He has described that week as so traumatic, so overwhelming in its intensity, that he struggles to remember it clearly, the mind's way of protecting itself from things too large to hold consciously. But he made it through. And when the pathology came back, the news was the best kind, cancer-free. No chemotherapy, no radiation, just recovery, slow and deliberate and humbling. The body insisting on its own pace regardless of what tour schedules or residency contracts might prefer. His May 2026 Las Vegas shows were postponed. He announced he was not quite ready for Vegas. But his United Kingdom concerts, his final ever UK shows at the London Palladium, were still on for June. He told People magazine, "From the other side of the surgery, something that cut through all the awards and the record sales and the decades of performed emotion. It has really made me take stock of my life. This made me stop and think about, have I done what I wanted to do? And have I made people happy? Have I made people happy?" That is the question at the center of Barry Manilow's entire existence. Not have I been rich or famous or critically acclaimed, because the critics were never kind, and he knows it, and he has always known it. The academics and the tastemakers spent decades sneering at his music, calling it schmaltzy and bombastic, dismissing the emotional directness of his melodies as something less than art. And he looked at the sold-out arenas and the people who wept at his shows and understood, with quiet certainty, that the critics were measuring the wrong thing. Because what Barry Manilow did, what he has always done, is give people permission to feel. His songs arrived at the moments in people's lives when emotion was biggest and most unwieldy, and they provided a container for it. Mandy, for the love you could not keep. Can't Smile Without You, for the person who rearranged your whole interior world. Weekend in New England, for the longing that lives in distance. Copacabana, for the way joy and tragedy can occupy the same body, the same story, the same breath. He understood something about human feeling that the critics who dismissed him never quite grasped, that emotional accessibility is not weakness, that making people feel deeply is not a lesser achievement than making them think, that the woman sitting in the third row at the Westgate Las Vegas, crying at a song she has heard 300 times, is having an experience as real and as valid as anything that happens in a concert hall with better acoustics and a more respectable program. And The Notebook, that small, ordinary notebook from Barry's childhood in Williamsburg, the one where the fatherless boy with the borrowed name wrote down fragments of melody and the beginnings of songs. It was never really a notebook. It was a conversation he was having with himself, trying to find words and sounds for everything he was not allowed to say out loud. The music was always the place where the real Barry lived, not the careful, managed, public Barry who smiled at cameras and deflected personal questions. The one who sat at a piano and let something true move through his hands and his voice. The one who wrote, "I write the songs," and meant it as literally as a prayer. He is 82 years old. He is cancer-free. He is married to a man he has loved for nearly 50 years, in a house in Palm Springs surrounded by the desert silence that is the opposite of everything Brooklyn ever was. He has a stepdaughter. He has a grandchild. He has, in the accounting that matters to him more than any chart position or award, made people happy. In July, when he returns to the stage at the Westgate Las Vegas, there will be people in that audience who have seen him dozens of times, who know every lyric, who have brought their children and their grandchildren to see him perform, who have built something like a relationship with a man they have never met through the medium of his music. And he will stand at that microphone with one less lobe of lung than he had last year, and he will sing, because it is the only thing he has ever truly known how to do. Now here is what I want to say to you, because this story is not only about Barry Manilow. This story is about the dot, not the one on the lung scan, the dot that was always there inside you, the small, silent thing you have been managing and hiding and working around because you were afraid of what it would mean if other people saw it. Barry Manilow carried his dot for 50 years. He built an entire global career around music that was purely emotional and kept his deepest emotion entirely hidden. He married a woman he loved but could not be true with. He fell in love with a man and spent 37 years making sure the world did not find out. He thought the revelation would cost him everything. It cost him nothing. The people who loved his music loved him more when they knew the whole story. You have been doing your own version of this. Maybe not for 50 years. Maybe not on a stage in front of 10,000 people. But you know the thing you have been managing. The identity you have been presenting to the world instead of the one that actually fits. The version of yourself you have kept hidden because you were certain, absolutely certain, that the real version would disappoint someone, would change how people saw you, would cost you something you could not afford to lose. And the dot on the scan, the unexpected, accidental discovery that forces you to stop and reckon, yours may not arrive as a medical image. It may arrive as a conversation, a loss, a moment of quiet when the managed version of yourself finally falls silent and you are left with only the true one. Barry Manilow sat in a Palm Springs living room and said, after everything, after the surgery, the ICU, the cancer, the 5 decades of concealment, the Grammys, the Fanilows, the records, the Broadway shows, the Las Vegas residencies, all of it. He sat there and asked himself if he had made people happy. That little notebook from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, filled with the private language of a boy turning his longing into music, had traveled 60 years to arrive at that question. And the answer, which he already knows even as he asks it, is yes. Unmistakably, undeniably, abundantly yes. But here is the question I leave you with, the one that belongs to you and not to him. When your moment of reckoning comes, and it will come, quiet as a dot on a scan, ordinary as a hip that hurts, will you be able to say the same? Not about fame, not about records sold or awards won or arenas filled. Just the simple, enormous, irreducible thing. Have you been who you actually are? Have you let people love the real version of you? The one that needed no management, no concealment, no borrowed name? Barry Manilow spent half a century finding out that the answer to that question costs less than you think. The only real question is how long you are willing to wait before you find out for yourself.